Hello, America. Welcome to the Junto Podcast, where we promote the practical applications of critical thinking and bold creativity. I am your host, Edgar Mills. Thanks for joining us. Violence. Violence is never the answer until it's the only answer. What about that? Hello, good folks. Welcome to this episode. Thanks for sticking with me. Today, we're going to talk about a thing. Now, look, I don't normally do the sort of flavor of the week topics, but today, because I had this topic on deck, it just happens to be yet another incident to reiterate. Today, we're going to be talking about active killers, active shooters, and things like that. And what we're going to talk about is, maybe some examples, but we're going to talk about some ways to combat these active killers. So, and also, look, I'm going to give you, of course, my opinion from an objectively formed opinion, but with a libertarian lean, of course. But mainly, we're going to focus on facts. We're going to focus on how to be prepared, just sort of generally. And then we're going to talk about some tactics and things like that. And we're going to kind of avoid speculations on motives and all that. A lot of these motives are pretty obvious. Some of them less so. So let's get into it. There's a couple of examples, and I tell you, I'm going to start with the one that was just, day before yesterday, and that is the Catholic school in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, ultimately, I think 2 kids were critically injured, and I think they died. And then about 17 folks were injured, mostly children. And as that plays out, I'm calling that an external human threat. Keep that phrase in mind because we're going to hit that later. And this was a 23-year-old guy who identified as a woman, transgender woman, and he went into this Catholic church school and fired through windows and during Mass, right? It was a planned attack. He left a manifesto of uniquely written language. He made references to Sandy Hook. He had his AR-15 magazines with slogans on them, like "Kill Donald Trump" and "This one's for the kids," and just bizarre stuff like that. So, again, guy walked into and shot through church windows at a Mass. There was a shooting in Perry High School in Iowa. This was last year. It was the first day back from winter break. The shooter was a 17-year-old, and he had a pump-action shotgun and a handgun. And he had some improvised explosive devices. And I think he killed, I only think it was a couple. He opened fire in a cafeteria, and he obviously, students and staff, I think an 11-year-old died, and 4 other students and a principal were shot. And so not that many, but the commonality here is it was at a school. The whole thing lasted about 5 minutes, and then he shot himself, as did the Robert Westman of the Catholic school shooting. So he killed himself, and then police came and just had to clean it up. Let's see. Let's find another one here. Oh, okay. Close to home. And this was just, last year, not quite a year ago, almost a year ago, Appalachian High School in Winder, Georgia. The circumstances of that were that this was a younger kid, 14, arrived to school on the bus, and he had an AR-15 with him. How did that happen? I don't know. He had it concealed in the backpack. He had a knife, and this was his first day back to school after like a 9 days absent. I don't know if that was a suspension or if he was sick or what. Now, this guy had a history of threats, online threats, and he walked out of his algebra class in the morning, came back with his gun, was denied entry into the classroom and because the door was locked. And then he just started firing in the hallway and in other classrooms, and He killed 2 students and 2 teachers, and then injured several more. Now, what's unique about this one? Yes, it was in a school, and he was a student at that school. So I'm going to call that internal human threat. He went to that school. He had reason. He had placement, right? He had a reason to be at that school. So that's what we're calling an internal human threat. And let's keep that in mind. And ultimately, that guy's dad got charged. Yeah, that guy's dad got charged. Now, you can like it or lump it. Yeah, I mean, I think parents are responsible for their children's behavior as youth. At some point in the teen years, that becomes a little more gray area, though, doesn't it? So that guy's dad is in jail right now, and that kid, I don't know what his status is right now. He didn't die. He didn't kill himself. Let me see if I can see let's see. I don't see. Yeah, he was arrested, but I don't know what his current status is. I got to imagine he's in some kind of mental sort of lockdown. Yeah, I got to imagine. But his dad is certainly in jail for giving him free access, unsupervised access to an AR-15 rifle. All right. So that's just a few examples. I'm not coming on here to talk about those things in detail. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about school shootings, church shootings, workplace shootings, or any other kind of violence, whether it's shootings or just stabbing or whatever else, or bombs or anything. Workplace, house of worship, and education, places where violence can be done. Now, what was the thing I said at the very beginning of the episode, folks? I said violence. Violence is never the answer until it's the only answer. Some of you may take issue with that. The legitimately only way to stop someone who's willing to trade their life for carnage is to kill that person. Now, a lot of these happen to play out, not just the ones I mentioned, but a lot of them, mass shootings, play out with the person committing suicide once they're confronted or have been, they feel like there's no further exit or whatnot, or they've killed who they wanted to kill, things like that. All right, so these examples illustrate the impact of immediate action. In these places, now, what do you like it or not, if you work at a school or if you're on staff at a church or any workplace, now commercial workplaces normally have their own security thing. And a lot of churches have their own little volunteer security teams, they'll call them. Yeah, they'll have that. And then schools, arguably the most precious resource, our children, are protected by like one single resource, a school resource officer. And I know for a fact here where I'm at, I think one school resource officer, SRO, covers multiple schools. So what does that mean? Like, there is no actual security at any of the schools. That person just goes and does their rounds. And you can correct me if I'm wrong in that, but I'm pretty sure that's true, that there's only one SRO up here. So let's talk about some overall doctrine on how to deal with these issues. Department of Homeland Security and the FBI tell us, and I'm sure you guys have heard this, and sort of the framework is run, hide, fight, right? That's the three word sort of catchphrase: run, hide, fight. And that's what they tell all these people, civilians and schools and churches and everything else. Does that hold water? Is that correct? Should fight be the final recourse? Now, clearly, if you can run away, do. But that especially in a situation like a school where there's possibly 500-600 kids and, 4 exits, right? It's hard to run away. You might be able to hide and lock doors and harden structures work. We'll get to all that hardened structure stuff. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about preparation that any school, any church, and any workplace can sort of think about. And first of all, you have to acknowledge that these threats do exist. And we'll go over these in a little detail later, but everybody's living, if you're living in rainbows and clouds and unicorns world, and you don't acknowledge that these things exist, you're setting yourself up for failure. Now, it may never happen in your church, your school, or your workplace, ever. But when it does, it's going to be catastrophic unless you have plans, emergency action plans, things to do if. And these include, kind of routes. Everybody knows what the fire drills are, right? Schools do, or they did when I was in school, they did fire drills all the time. And everybody just kind of got together and walked in an orderly fashion out whichever exit closest to them. I remember we even had like when I was very young, we had like nuclear, bomb plant where you had to get under your desk and put your head between your legs. It was bizarre. It could have been hurricane. I want to say it was. I want to say it was the same for hurricane and for like a bomb. Put your head between your legs. And what the teachers didn't follow up and say is kiss your ass goodbye, right? So there needs to be some kind of drill. Now, I know it's nearly impossible to make 700 people get on the same sheet of music. I'm fully aware. But it's not impossible. It's just nearly. And then so during this preparation sort of phase here, you got to develop some credible plans and you got to be able to test those plans. You got to have some viable action. You've heard the see something, say something stuff. Well, especially kids, they're not going to snitch, right? Probably. Unless the kid's like a real weird oddball and he's been targeted for bullying and stuff like that anyway. Not for bullying, but as a target for the bullies, which I think is probably the case in a lot of cases. See something, say something. Yeah. Well, how good is that? You have to elaborate on that. And you have to show them the channels in which to go. Like, ideally, I suppose, if a kid thought another kid had a AR-15, he would go to the school resource officer and say, hey, I'm pretty sure this kid's got an AR-15. I would think. But if you only got one SRO for covering, 4 or 5 schools, I guess you go to the principal or to any teacher, really. But yeah, who knows? That lends itself to kids in a similar fashion. When people SWAT someone else, they call the SWAT team or police on this person's doing this, that, and the other, and the SWAT team shows up, and you wake up, ass naked with your flip-flops on, go to the door and be like, what? What's the problem? Is there human trafficking going on here? No. I was swatted. Situational awareness. Kids, how much do kids know about situational awareness? I don't know. How much do churchgoers know about situational awareness? I don't know. Because when you're in church, you probably feel like you're in a safe space. So your guard is probably a little down, actually. Yeah. You got to have some, not just catchphrases, see something, say something, but you got to have a viable sort of reporting SOP. And it's got to be easy. It's got to be user-friendly. I believe in scenario-based training. And I know, again, it's hard to have, 400, 500 students doing the same scenario all at the same time. It's probably hard to have, 100 congregation of 100 doing the same thing at the same time. But there needs to be some kind of, you have to test your SOPs. You can't just write it down on a piece of paper and say, okay, this is it. It exists. And it doesn't. It doesn't exist. This is a thing that I've been told all my career is an SOP isn't an SOP unless everyone knows it. So even if you put it in a memo and an email and send it out, that doesn't mean everyone knows it. You need to walk through these things. It's called rehearsals. Yeah, you got to go rehearse. So for preparation, those are the things that need to be done. There needs to be some kind of plans to address specific emergencies, detailed plans. Then there needs to be legitimate, simplistic reporting sort of method. And then there needs to be some testing of those plans, some scenario-based sort of checking them against reality, run things in real time. All right, and then you have the response, right? The run, hide, fight, which is what the FBI and the DHS tells us. If you can run, it's always better if you can break contact. If you can. Yeah, break contact. Get out of there. But now you have a teacher in a class for, let's say it's an elementary school. You have a teacher in a class with 25, 7-year-olds. And if the teacher doesn't maintain their cool, then panic is really going to ensue. Chaos is really going to take over. And then you've got all these scared kids. And now if you try to run with all that, yeah, I mean, that's a major obstacle to safely get 25 kids, never mind like the whole hallway and 6 or 8 classrooms of kids come running out in the hallway. So running is, yeah, it's an option, but I don't know how practical it is, And then obviously call 911. Hide. Secure cover spots. Well, it says cover. Does the general public know the difference between concealment and cover? Because you can hide, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stop bullets. Yeah, you might be able to hide, but that doesn't mean you're going to stop the bullets. So what they assume is every school has some kind of secure, hardened spot for you to hide in. Now, there's been some aftermarket companies who've created these little sort of mobile safe rooms, every class, kind of a fold out, kind of open it up. Kids get in there and then you can lock it, and it's meant to be like a safe room or a panic room. So, I mean, there's all kind of weird stuff going on. But understand that if your school, there may be some good natural hiding spots, maybe. And it depends on how determined the active shooter is to go look and peek in all these spaces. And we'll get to stuff like that. But anyway, they encourage us to run or hide in a secure spot if possible, or barricade behind locked doors and all that, and then be quiet and stay low. And then finally, the government says as a last resort, improvise weapons and execute aggressive disruption. Does that sound thorough to you, the good people listening to this podcast? Improvise weapons and then aggressively disrupt. So the guy walking around the hallway with an AR-15, you get, I don't know, maybe your craft scissors, the ones that have the rounded tips on them. Is that a good improvised weapon? Nah, I guess maybe you got to go in the teacher's drawer for some teacher scissors, the big sharp ones. What other improvised weapon are you going to pull out of a school? I guess if it's in the gym, you could pull out some baseball bats, but that's a close proximity tool right there, folks. I don't think you're going to disrupt a assed up 16-year-old walking down the hall with an AR-15 with a baseball bat, unless you can sneak up on them, I guess. And this is going to lead, folks. I'm going to lead into suggestions and answers here from my perspective. And then post-incident, cooperate with law enforcement. No kidding. Give aid to victims. No kidding. Seek out mental health for the trauma. So, no kidding. Key emphasis. Incidents usually only last somewhere, 5-7 minutes average. The incidents usually are so soft targets are easier, and they can get the job done quicker. If they can get into school, especially if it's an external threat, if they can get in unchecked, unconfronted, then it's easy targets. So that's one thing. Yeah. And predators normally go after soft targets. I think on one of the school shootings, and I can't remember, let's see, I think the Uvalde Elementary School, or Uvalde, Texas, and that elementary school shooting, I think the shooter had considered going to another place, but there was security that was too, just too much of a hassle to get through. So it chose a soft target. So if you run, yes, statistically, based on these instances, given the fact that instances don't last that long, running is statistically the safest way. And people are apt to run in a situation like that. Now, you guys have all heard of fight, flight, or freeze, but I'm sure a child or even high school age are more apt to run than confront. Now, what the FBI reckons is that if you run, that prevents herding, right? It prevents large groups massing together. But I beg to differ, because everything inside of a school, every hallway, every room, even in a big wide open gym, there's only 4 exits. So everybody bottlenecks in these places. The FBI says it prevents herding if you run. That's assuming you're an individual running away from a thing. That's not assuming 500 kids running away from a thing. And then they say that if you hide, that buys you time. That the FBI reckons that there is a 50 to 75 or 70% survival chance based on simulations if you hide. Then the FBI tells us cleverly that that exploits the shooter's impatience. So maybe he'll just get mad because he don't have immediate targets, and then he just, I don't know, go away, I guess. I don't know. And then the FBI reckons that if you fight, that the pros of that is that, and I want to use, I think, Virginia Tech shooting several years ago. I want to say 1 or 2 of the students ended up subduing the guy, I think. So when one person steps up, that usually emboldens other, especially in a friend group or something. Like if you're a guy and you step up and go, no, we got to take this guy out. You're going to have a couple of homies that say, yeah, let's do it, right? But again, if you're going up against firepower, or even a guy with a knife, I mean, that's a dangerous undertaking. Now, I happen to lean toward that. But if I'm gonna push that, then what by default do I have to push also? Yeah, I think that we should have more firearms in schools, but we'll get to it. So this run, hide, fight thing, yeah, I guess it's a simplistic view. And I guess if you were able to practice those regularly, you might get something out of that. But let's talk about what the FBI reckons is risky. Now, they said it prevents herding, right? Run. But then they turn around and say, well, it risks chaos and mobility issues. Right? 1, do you know the school enough to get to the closest exit? 2, what if you're a special needs kid cruising around in your little electric scooter that only goes 1.5 miles per hour? And 3, mass chaos. You've got mass chaos. That's all there is to it. If you hide, what they turn around and say is, yeah, you can hide if you have something to barricade with. But what if you get found out? Then you're sitting duck. You're stuck, right? And then obviously it's no good like in the gym. It's pretty hard. You could go to the locker room, I guess. But other than that, you either got to get out. There's no place to hide in the gym. Even if you hunker down behind the bleachers. Yeah. So, and then they reckon there's less than 20% chance. Now, they do caveat this, and I'll say this. They say fight is a very low success option. Less than 20% chance of surviving if you fight. But then they caveat that by saying, if you're unarmed. Because they want very desperately not to say, hey, we need guns in schools. They're trying desperately not to say that. 20%, less than 20% chance of surviving if you're unarmed. Yep. So in general, all this is really, this is all reaction. This is all reaction to a thing. And it really only addresses one school shooter. Now, I'm sure, I guess we all remember Columbine, and there was a couple of guys. And then they're assuming people do drills at their work or school or church or whatever. And then this whole run, hide, fight thing assumes the police are going to be there really, really quick. I point you back to Uvalde. So yeah, I like it. It's a very governmental answer to a problem. It's very simplistic, run, hide, fight. It's very, very practical in terms of understanding. But is it effective? Is it effective in real life? I don't know. I don't think so. That's me personally. I don't think so. And now, am I going to sit here and tell you, yeah, I'm a special operator, but I don't have experience in school shootings per se. But I know what skills you need to harden a structure. I know what skills you need to assess a threat, and that's that that's 90% of the battle right there, folks. Assess the threat and harden your structure accordingly, and then have the right kind of security. All right, so let's look at. I do a course on this, by the way. I do it for schools and for churches, and I've done it for both, to where we talk about security considerations. And it's in a lecture format. We don't go out and shoot each other with blue gun, which that is an option, but it's very difficult to replicate on a mass scale. Like if you have the opportunity to get, I don't know, 50 to 100 role players to be students and to be teachers and everybody's able to wear some protective gear, and then you have some folks with UTM weapons. I mean, I guess you could set up some scenarios and try to replicate some scenarios, but that'd be very difficult to replicate. I've seen some videos on YouTube, folks, with, various police they're doing this bizarre stuff. And now police response is different than us as an organization, as the school organization or the church organization. Now the police have a different training methodology on this from the perspective of a responding officer, right? If you're in the school as a teacher or as a student or whatever, you're not the responding officer, and there's different things you should do. So, but this security considerations course I do, or lecture, essentially it's a lecture. We talk about threats like active killers, and then we talk about practical strategies to kind of mitigate that. Preparation is the utmost importance. You got to objectively analyze the threat. Yeah. And then you got to have plans. You got to have SOPs, simple and effective SOPs that everyone can learn, that when the signal is given, that you can execute. Now, I'm going to say this, folks, and I say it all the time. I said it when I was in combat. I say it every time I'm doing any kind of lecture like this. If an individual is willing to give his own life in order to take someone else's life, there's very little you can do to stop him. Very little. A suicide bomber who is willing to go blow himself up is very likely going to achieve, maybe not his total objective, but he's going to get someone. He's going to get someone. Now, we're talking about suicide bombers, which doesn't apply necessarily. That's not a thing we've seen here so far with school, church type stuff. So what are some things that you as an organization, be it school, church, or business, what are some key things you got to look at? What is your current security posture? Do you have one? Yeah. Do you have security personnel? And if you do, what is their composition? What is their disposition? What are their roles and responsibilities? How trained are they to do the thing that they need to do should the worst case scenario happen? I don't know. What is your current situation? What about facility access? Can anyone walk in off the street? Now, if you're a commercial business, a lot of times, you have to be open to, if you're a church, you kind of have to be open to the public. So is access unfettered? Is it unmonitored? Right? Do you have unattended or unlocked external building entries and exits that are hidden, that aren't normally used, but someone could get in or out of? Do you have video monitoring? Any sort of video monitoring, internal and external, on the property at all? Is there a way to replay? Can you see if an incident does happen? Do you have video going back and looking at it? Now, I know most churches, they video the preacher's sermons, but they probably ain't got video anywhere else. Maybe in the daycare or kids' Sunday school section. Maybe. Do you have any sort of alert, alarm, communication system at all? Do you have any sort of way to contact police other than just 911? Do you have any sort of SOP for any sort of crisis? Now, most schools have a fire drill, right? Do you have any other SOP whatsoever? Is there any kind of chain of command for when an emergency does happen? Do you have any kind of control measures for your students or for your personnel at all? Is there a way? Now, I know back in the day, a lot of schools had loudspeakers. So from the principal's office, boom, you talk to the whole school. But even then, that didn't cover every piece of ground on that school. So is there a way to alert people that there's some kind of situation to disseminate information? Is there anyone inside of your little crisis management team, if you have one? Is there anybody who is the specific person to connect, to liaison essentially with law enforcement and EMS? Now, I know in a lot of schools you have the one school resource officer, and he's that guy, right? But what if you don't have that SRO? Is there anyone else there? Is it the front desk lady? Is it the principal, vice principal? I don't know. Think about these things, folks. If you work or are on staff at any of these, do you have any of that stuff in play right now? Okay. What threat are we even talking about? So the hot topic is always active killers. That's the hot topic because that's the one that's so scary, right? You're just in school, minding your own business, and boom, bad things are happening. So I'm going to say, and I said this earlier, we're going to categorize the threats. So there's internal human threat, and I categorize that as somebody who works there, staff or student or congregation, somebody who goes there normally. They're not out of place by being there. The janitor, friggin', the guy who delivers water or whatever, that's kind of an internal human threat. And then there's an external human threat, estranged parents, right? You got a dad who's got a restraining order and he comes into the school trying to pick up his kid. Now, most schools have a sign in, sign out sort of thing. They've kind of stepped that up a little bit. That's not foolproof, especially if the kid is in cahoots with the estranged parent. But an external human threat is somebody who's not normally there, right? Strangers, somebody who comes in off the street. And then we got physical space. We got internal physical space, which is self-explanatory, inside of your building, inside of the rooms and the buildings and the structures. Then you got your external physical space, which is the parking lots, playgrounds, football field, all the places that are outside but on the property. And that includes where all the transportation, the bus lanes, wherever you stack up for, pick up and drop off for car riders. All those places, those are external. If you break it down like that, then you can sort of dissect this a little bit better. We can figure out whether these people, well, we can help to learn what their motives might be. But situational awareness plays a big deal here when looking for early warning signs of people who are the internal threats, right? The kids, like a lot of these shooters, these active killers that go to these schools, they've been called out before, or they've been had some kind of interaction with law enforcement before, or have been reported before, and just no action was taken. And sometimes, you can, if a kid is known to have a violent dad or abusive house, you know what I mean? And because some teachers are on the job and they're aware of those types of things and they pay attention to those types of things. But that's one possible way to look at early warning signs. But then these random external threats, usually there's no real early warning, right? No real early detection. So we're going to look at what I think the most likely course of action is and what I think the most dangerous course of action as it relates to active killers in your school or church. And it changes a little bit based on location, especially with churches. So what is the most dangerous course of action? An unknown external threat, and we'll say male based on history, whether it's a trans male, whatever or not. Unknown, that holds some kind of either extremist belief or has some kind of instability, some kind of issue, psychological issue, He plans to go into your facility and just rampage with multiple weapons and kill as many people as possible until he is killed or commits suicide, causing mass carnage. That is the most dangerous course of action, most dangerous scenario, in my opinion. And then the most likely scenario, in my opinion, is that it is an internal, a known, someone who goes to school or goes to the church, a known male who possibly has some mental instability or anger issues or is a target of bullying, and he targets specific individuals with some sort of weapon, and then has a plan to escape, but may or may not get caught, may or may not commit suicide once he is confronted. So that'll be minimal casualties, right? He targets someone specifically, takes out those 2 or 3 people, either kills himself or just walks out and gets picked up later. I think that's the most likely scenario based on a whole bunch of active killer things, not just in schools and churches, but a whole bunch. So of those two, I think it's most likely that the person is there to target probably specific people or specific groups of people. There may be some political ideology there, as we saw with this last one. So either way, we need to be prepared for those. Whether it's an internal, now internal is far more dangerous. Someone who goes to the school, goes to the church, that's far more dangerous because they might be able to sneak in some kind of weapon. But if this person wants to do damage and commit suicide, there's not much you can do to stop them once the attack is underway. You can prevent things, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the facility, right? Can you get controlled access to your facility, external and internal? Now, I went to one high school that had an outer perimeter. You had to go through a gate just to get to the parking lot, and the gate had a guy there. And then you had to go through a point that was monitored by, well, it was teachers. It wasn't security folks, but you had to go into a point that was monitored by teachers. Parking permits, if you're in high school or church, have parking permit. And I know parking, the last thing a church wants to think about is isolated sectional parking, right? But if you got people who are members of the church, give them a parking permit, they park someplace, and then you got unknowns parking all in the same place. That kind of thing, right? Badging for staff. And when I say badging, I mean that does the locks, and the magnetic locks and things like that. That stuff costs a lot of money, I know, but, key cards and things like that. But having manned entry points, external and internal, and then having alarms at those manned points. Now, I know this seems like, Edgar, we don't want our schools and churches to look like a federal lockdown. I concur. These things can be done in a low vis way. You don't have to put everybody in like jack boots and black uniforms, right? You don't have to do that. But technical monitoring is what I'm saying. Now, technical monitoring only goes so far. The people who are doing the monitoring of the technical stuff, they have to be vigilant for sure. But that's all technical stuff, right? I think there should be video. Anything that the government's got his hands on, public schools, police, hospitals, anything that the government has its hands on, I believe should be videoed. Yeah. And I said this before about schools. I think a camera in every classroom will keep the teachers honest and keep the students honest. Yep, I think so. We can argue the nuances of that another time. Anyway, controlled access, folks. That's what I'm getting at. Controlled access, whatever level of that you think you need. Some places got metal detectors. Some places got some big old burly SRO out there with a wanding everybody, which is not that efficient, but whatever. But more importantly, hardening the target, physically hardening the target. Now, yeah, again, this costs money. That's a point we'll talk about. Ballistic glass, steel doors, things like that. Now, look, I'm going to throw some silly stuff out here, but simple techniques like deception. If you put signs up on all the entries and exits of your school that says, warning, staff are armed, hey, it's a deterrent. It may work, it may not, but it might cause someone a second thought. Yeah. So deception is a thing. I wouldn't depend on it, but why not? All right, let's talk about arming teachers for a minute. I'm on board with arming teachers, but there's a lot of stuff that go along with that. A lot of stuff that goes along with that. Arming teachers and staff at schools and in churches, folks, and in churches, and even at your workplace. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with it. You got to have some kind of criteria. There has to be some standard. People who have guns need to have a standard of safety and training. Having that tool inside of a school with an incompetent person is just as dangerous as a goddamn active killer. Security teams, designated security teams, whether it's, whether it's your own employees and that's a residual duty, or whether you specifically hire security people. But whoever's in charge of that team they have to one, have authority to do it, and they have to be responsible people. Then they have to be vetted. They have to be trained. Then you have to clearly delineate roles and responsibilities. And that's a lot of stuff. People don't want to undertake that stuff. And what about those people carrying guns? Well, they probably need a little bit of medical training too. I think everybody should have a little bit of medical training regardless. That way, even if your staff is unarmed, at least have some daggum first aid kits on hand. I'd say probably in every classroom, and to include tourniquets and things like that, but even other stuff. So you got to have a bare minimum level of training just to arm personnel. Now, again, I advocate that, but I don't advocate it lightly. You got to have some kind of firearms qualification. And I'm not talking about some bullcrap police qualification. I'm not talking about some bullcrap sheriff comes out, you shoot at a giant silhouette at 10 yards and then call it good. I'm talking about a legitimate skills-based qualification. Then you got to have some kind of mindset development. Now, technical shooting is technical shooting. But first of all, if you're going to arm a teacher, that teacher's got to agree to that, right? That teacher's got to, you're going to have a lot of teachers that will dissent, folks. They are not comfortable. They want, some teachers, if you allow firearms in school, there's some teachers that'll quit. We all know that the educational system in general has a lot of liberal people in it. And they're not right, wrong, or otherwise for not liking that, I guess. But again, violence is never the answer until it's the only answer. So now you got to have teachers who are willing to, and staff who are willing to be armed. And then you have to get them trained up to a level. And then they have to be, so let's say they have trained and they shoot pretty well and they carry a gun. Now can they function under violence? Are they going, you know what I mean? Are they cut out for that? You don't go into education because you're an action guy. You go into education because you like academics and you like being around kids and teaching people how to do things, intellectually. And then there's got to be some follow-on training. You can't just get the initial training and call it good. It's an ongoing thing, folks. It's an ongoing thing. And then your school, and then we got to have insurance for that. Now, firearms ranges has insurance all over the place, right? But now you're dealing with teachers who, well, providing you have a legitimate training program, that'll mitigate some of the insurance. But you're talking about, now I'm sure insuring schools is probably pretty steep anyway, but there's probably got to be insurance that covers that. And then what about those teachers that do dissent? They don't want to be armed. Do they have a role? Do they have a role and responsibility when it comes to sort of what I call special teams, right? Can they respond to medical emergencies? Can they be the ones who relay information, communicate with the principal's office or the sheriff's department, things like that? You got to have somebody for crowd control. You got to manage the children. And I would say, in my experience, middle school is the most chaotic of all the levels, right? High school, you got a bunch of kids who think they're grown, So they'll do whatever. Elementary school, yeah, they're wild kids, but they'll kind of do whatever the group does. Middle schoolers, oh my God, madness, absolute chaos. You got to have somebody to do crowd control and to execute whatever the SOP is with those children. So think about those things. And these are wave top things, folks. There's so many nuances to all these things. What are some other variables? What we're talking about here is active killers, but there's some stuff beyond that, right? One, cost analysis. Nobody, to include me especially, don't want my taxes raised. And a school is, where's the funding going to come from for that? Hardening your structure can be a very expensive endeavor. Hiring trained security personnel can be a very expensive endeavor. So you got to have some, sources, some budget sources. I'd say, yeah, without raising taxes. And you got to have budget priorities. If is security a priority for you? If it's not, just admit that it's not. Don't talk bull crap and then say, yes, security is our highest priority when it's not. And then you got risk where, like I said, there's going to be some people who are not on board with that. Armed teachers or armed school staff or church staff. Is there less lethal options that we could use and train on? Yeah. And then there's always, I said, dissenting staff, right? Somebody who's say they're this a hard left liberal, they absolutely ain't going to stand for. Well, what about parents? Do parents just have to suck on it if they disagree with that? I mean, they can go vote on it, I guess. Yeah. And then finally we got the reality of violence. This thing's just got to be dealt with. Now, some schools react to that. They hear it on the news. Oh, we're offering counseling and we're offering this and that, but there's a hardcore psychological effect for if you got your 23-year-old fresh out of college art teacher who has to blast some 17-year-old kid. There's going to be some emotional scars there, right? So how are we going to move forward from this? You got to assess the threats, one, correctly, right? The analysis of the threats. What's reality? What's most likely? What's most dangerous? You got to assess your priorities because, on composite risk management stuff, right? You've got the likelihood of a thing happening, and then you've got the severity of a thing happening. So if it's a thing that if it happens, it's going to be catastrophic. There's a whole lot of things, even though the likelihood of it happening is very low, it's still a very high outcome, very high risk outcome. So you still have to mitigate that. Now, if there's if it's more likely to happen, but then the severity of it is low, like, oh yeah, we had a threat come in here and he smacked a couple kids around in the mouth, told them they were stupid, and then ran out the door. Yeah, I mean, I get it. Nobody wants their kid to get hit, but that's not a severe outcome. Kid just got smacked. I oversimplified that to death, but, if it's very likely to happen, even though it's a low severity outcome, but it's very likely to happen, you still have to mitigate. You still have to do things to prevent it. So as you move forward and you're assessing your place of work or your place of worship or your school, consider those things. Think about some unconventional methods. What are some unconventional ways to strengthen security without spinning an arm and a leg or having to go, jump through hoops and coddle parents' balls because they don't want any crazy stuff. Now, I'd argue that most parents would welcome more stringent security measures if they thought you were competent to execute those measures. Well, you can certainly develop and disseminate SOPs even with what you got, right? You can certainly conduct rehearsals even with just what you got now. You could get an outside advisor like myself or many others to come in and do an assessment for a very reasonable cost, folks, and to come in and do an assessment and go, yeah, here's where you could use work. Here's where it's most vulnerable. Here's where it's most safe, and et cetera, et cetera. Doing a threat analysis, any Green Beret out there can do a threat analysis for you. threat of vulnerability assessment on your hard structure or just the area in general, because you still need to know what's going on around you. And let me tell you, I said I'd go back to that because it changes for churches, right? If your church is out in the country and you're in a residential area and there's a country club right down the road, what's the most likely threat? Possibly, a angry, dejected sort of husband, divorced, or whatever, and he thinks his wife and the wife's going to church to try to, connect with Jesus and just get some help for her emotional, and then the husband's abusive and alcoholic, and he busts up in there Sunday morning, looking for his wife, and he thinks the preacher's banging his wife and all kind of stuff. And then you got a church that's, let's say, on the low end of town, and you got a homeless shelter, one block down, and you got dudes selling crack one block back, and this and that and the other. Well, it ain't crack anymore, I guess. I don't know what's the hot one today. Heroin, I guess, or meth, I guess. Now, what's the most likely threat? Is it that husband? Yeah, maybe. But also, you got dudes who are any stage of drug induced, or you got homeless guys who are in any stage of desperation. So they might come in and pose a threat. Now, if you're a church, you should welcome them in for sure. But again, you have to still have someone in that church, a security guy or whoever to assess, like, is this guy a threat? And then you got, be the first guy to meet this homeless guy and be like, hey, what's up, bro? What okay, And then there doesn't have to be any subterfuge. Hey, bro, you got any weapons or drugs on you? Because if you do, you can't come in. We're happy to see you, but you got to get rid of that stuff first. You see what I mean? There's ways to do things. Now, let's talk about a couple spots here. In the Appalachia High School shooting here in Georgia, over in Winder last year, that was ended when the SRO confronted the shooter, and the kid immediately gave up. So having an SRO on hand, on site, was critical there. One case that the Secret Service did an analysis on, an assistant principal, there was a 16-year-old that was stabbing classmates and staff members, went on a stabbing spree. And that's why I call it active killer and not active shooter, right? This 16-year-old went on a stabbing spree, and that assistant principal tackled that joker. And that ended the incident and mitigated more damage. So the value there, there wasn't a security team, but there's a vice principal there with enough balls to intervene. Now just think about that. The teacher had enough or the principal had enough balls to intervene. And that was arguably a very selfless act, right? That guy could have said, nah, man, I don't want to get stabbed. Called 911 and waited for some cops to show up. Instead, he tackled this kid. So everybody, every structure, every church, every school, you got to do threat assessments. You got to know what's the possibilities, what's the likelihoods, what's the most dangerous. So another study that Secret Service looked at, or they studied, a case that they studied, and there was a student who was acting very belligerent and threatening on a school bus, and he got reported by multiple kids, and then that led to a bunch of interviews and home checks and this and that and the other, and then daily monitoring by the school staff. So there was early warning. Kids in the see something, say something who did, and then that prompted. Now I'm never for government intervention in anything personally. However, but because of those kids saw something, said something, then the teachers, they ended up doing interviews. So it warranted them ensuring that this kid had no access to weapons. And so this kid, nothing ever happened. Now, would something have happened? Who knows? This kid said that it would. And no matter what kind of mental illness you're dealing with, you have to take people who give threats out, you have to take them at face value. And then there's, the Rand Research Institute, they did a thing, bystander intervention, right? when people step up and say something, and then they, as a group, sort of do this unspoken, hey, let's stop this guy, let's do it, boom. That has, of the research done in 12 different incidences, that has been a thing, and it stopped the shooter, and they were able to tackle, disarm the shooter. So what does that put emphasis on? A willingness, right, to be selfless and to be bold and to have a mindset that, yeah, I'm gonna, yes, you may get shot, but you may also stop 30 people from getting shot, right? So we've lost that in recent years in our society, where, people not want to be a hero, but do heroic things to protect others. So in all these things we just talked about, controlled access could have mitigated things. Trained personnel, armed personnel, could have certainly mitigated. And then proactive assessment of realistic threats. All right? That's where I'm at. Folks. Proactive assessment of realistic threats. Now I'm going to give you some numbers here, and you can take them how you want. The DOJ has a National Crime Victimization Survey. And in that survey, up to potentially, its estimates of up to 120,000 defensive gun uses per year, where people use a gun to stop further violence or deter violent crime. Now that accounts for people who reported the incidents, not for anyone who didn't. Now I can tell you now, I've drawn my gun 3 times as a civilian, and I've never had to, I never had to shoot anyone, thank God, but I never reported it. There's a broader survey out there that estimates somewhere up to 2.5 million defensive uses of firearms to deter violent crime. Yeah. An armed society is a polite society, good people. I carry my gun all day, everywhere. I think you should too, because you never know. Violence is random. You can't always predict it. But if it happens in front of you, good chance you can stop it. All right. Look, folks, preparation saved life. Honest assessment, objective assessment of your security posture as an individual or as an organization. Adapt your SOPs and your strategies and your behavior accordingly. Train. Now, firearms training is a very technical skill, folks. Just isolate the skill. Train to be a fast and accurate shooter. And then you can look at scenarios, and you can do your mindset in a different sort of environment, right? Thinking about that stuff. But it's critical that the skill is there if you're going to be armed. And I said it earlier, SOP is not SOP unless everybody knows it. So if you had some kind of weird experience, now look, I know I'm always asking for feedback. If you have had some kind of near violent experience, some active shooter situation or some knife situation, or where you got robbed, and things like that, send it, share. I would love to hear a real-time example. So far, there's probably been 8, I don't know, maybe even 12 shootings this year, school shootings, that had injuries or death. There's other surveys out there that says there's potentially up to 146 school gun violence incidents. I don't recognize gun violence, folks. Violence is violence. I can stab you in the jugular with an ink pen, and you're going to die just the same, right? Everybody wants to blame a gun. It's not. It's a behavioral issue. And furthermore, as a behavioral issue, we need to call out psychological issues, mental issues. We need to call them out for what they are, folks. Call them out for what they are and stop glossing over mental issues, because it's not a gun problem. It's certainly 100% a mental issue. I hope you didn't just hear that outro music. Once again, I forgot to mute it. There's mental issues out there. There's anger issues. There's inability to function in a normal life. whatever it's from, if they're being sexually abused at home, if they're being indoctrinated by some activist factions, if if their dog just got run over and their girlfriend left them for their best friend, if whatever the reason, if they're mad because nobody recognizes their pronouns, it doesn't matter why you do it. There's some issue there. Even when I was a young guy, a violent, fighting, bar fighting all the time, there was a deeper issue. You don't go out and drink and bar fight without all the time, without there being a deeper issue there. And mine was that I had a chip on my shoulder, right? Because I was very, you're not better than me. Fuck you. Let's fight. I had that problem for a long time. There was a deeper issue there, folks. So we got to be able to recognize red flags and early warnings. And that doesn't mean red flag laws, ladies and gentlemen. I mean red flags in behavior and things that people relay verbally, body language, things like that. We've got to be able to start seeing the red flags. So good people, I felt compelled to do this one. I didn't expand on these shootings a lot in great detail because I didn't want to do that. One, I don't want to besmirch the dead by talking flippantly about them, and I don't want to lionize the shooters. And not that any of you out there listening are extremists in any way. Yeah, I imagine my listeners are pretty sane humans. I certainly hope and think that. But if you're at a church, if you're at a school, as a staff, all right, you need to start having a serious thought about security. You need to have a serious thought and start assessing what if, and get somebody who's credible. Now, look, I rip on cops all the time, but there's plenty of smart cops out there, plenty of them. Get a cop. If you don't want to pay an actual professional to come out, get a cop to come out and do a once-over on your school. Your SRO may or may not have the skill set that he needs to do that. And then it's easy to look at a problem and go, oh, yeah, we can't afford it, and then disregard it. What you need to do is look at a problem, and if you can't afford it, go, okay, well, how can we mitigate? How can we mitigate on the cheap? If it's got to be that way, it's got to be that way. Think about it. The safety of your children is at stake. Your safety is at stake. It's real easy for a school shooter to come in there, shoot a bunch of people up. The SRO shoots them, or the shooter commits suicide. Then everybody says, oh my God, the gun. And then the problem never gets answered. Or there's a knee-jerk reaction, and now your school gets then through all these magic funds that appear from various factions, now your school looks like a friggin' county jail with the entry protocol and all this and that. So if you get ahead of it and you prepare for it and you objectively analyze the threat, then you can mitigate. You can mitigate the damage. You can save lives. You can save more lives. Reach out to me, folks. I'm happy to go deeper into this with anyone who calls me or writes. Check us out at ospreyshootingsolutions.com. On Saturday, we have a wild card day. On Monday, Labor Day, we have a action pistol match. Let's see. Check us out at twoteamguys.com. December 5, 6, 7, we have the 3-day land navigation challenge. Well, it's a course and challenge. Or better said, it's a challenging course. 5, 6, 7 December. We got slots open for that. And I've put that on the website, by the way. You can sign up for that on the website now. Let's see. The Junto Podcast. Thank you for listening. Please continue to listen. I'm always looking for your feedback. I would like to do topics that people are interested in hearing about for sure. Someone reached out to me and said that I should think about doing a active killer episode. And so this thing up in Minnesota kind of prompted that. I was going to sit on this one for a while. But yeah, preparation, folks, SOPs, legitimate assessment of the potential threats out there and how can you mitigate them. All right, folks, I appreciate you. You guys be safe. Be good to each other. Treat each other with good manners. All right? Thanks for listening. I love you guys.